Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Garrett Smith to discuss the 14th century philosopher and theologian Duns Scotus. And in particular, we're going to be discussing what is often referred to as the Scotus Story, or the sort of popular presentation of Scotus's philosophy that you might find in philosophy or theology circles today. When you first bring up Duns Scotus to a philosophy or theology friend of yours, you're either met with an incredulous look of curiosity, as likely the person has never even heard of Duns Scotus, or you're met with open hostility, with claims that Scotus's thought allegedly heralded the problematic philosophies of modernity and the Enlightenment project. This narrative is what is often referred to as the Scotus Story, or the idea that Duns Scotus's thought was a radical departure from the philosophies of antiquity and scholasticism. Now, leaving aside the rather uncritical reactionary nature of this paradigm, many Scotus specialists have taken serious issue with this reading of Scotus, and many argue that it rests on what is ultimately a caricature of his philosophy and thought. We'll be discussing why the Scotus Story is a problematic caricature of what's really going on in Scotus, and how this so-called Scotus story became so popular as a narrative. Dr. Smith, how are you doing today?
Quite well, and thank you very much for the invitation.
So I figured before we begin, you could give us a brief introduction to your work and maybe your area of expertise in medieval scholasticism.
Right. Yes, I work in medieval philosophy. However, mainly the thought of Duns Scotus and his the school of thought he inspired. Often this, or kind of half what it involves manuscripts and the studying of different versions of text, and I mean, a lot of it's text-based. Since between Scotus and the printing press, about 200 years, 150 years, it's a lot of stuff that's kind of a key figures in the transmission of Scotus and Scotus ideas is not edited, and so there's kind of a gap between between Scotus himself and then the way he was interpreted immediately after his death and before the printing press, basically. With the Dominicans, it's a little different because they mandated Thomism by statute, beginning even in the 1280s. With the Franciscans, though, they never, during the medieval period, they never made anybody their official doctor. And so they tended to have a number of figures that people defended or tended to follow. Bonaventure, Scotus, and Occam are the main ones, but there are also lots of independent people that Levy and so on that simply just did their own thing.
If you could give us a brief introduction to Duns Scotus, who is Duns Scotus and why is he important to medieval philosophy and theology?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of a tall order. So, we know very little about his life. We don't know, of course, when he was born. We know maybe the date he was ordained to the priesthood in 1291. We know he was a Franciscan. He studied at Oxford. He went to Paris about 1302, was exiled, part of the controversy between the Pope and the King of France. Came back, finished his degree maybe around 1305, and became a master. Then in 1307, for unknown reasons, he was sent to Cologne, and he died in Cologne in 1308. And he wrote a number of commentaries on the works of Aristotle, the logical works, and questions of metaphysics. And these were probably from his earlier days. And they tend to be not literal commentaries like we have from Aquinas, but they're more thematic. They're questions based on the general theme of the Arian Aristotle's books. So Book 9, for example, Scotus is all about potency, but it's not a literal commentary. It's a series of questions related to the text of Aristotle. And then around the 1290s, he started Lection on the Sentences, the theology textbook of the time, and he's got 3 surviving commentaries from the sentences. One is the Lectura, which are early Oxford lectures. The Ordinatio is kind of his masterwork, or at least often been regarded as his masterwork. Kind of, so the early editors of Scotus kind of compare it to the Summa of Aquinas as kind of like a place where you go for the basic Scotus ideas. They also wrote a Reportatio, which Reportatio is a text that's have a student or a secretary that hears something and writes it down, which is one of the medieval ways for generating text, is somebody reads aloud a text. So Scotus would give lectures, and then we think that either his Socius, assigned by the order, or students wrote down what he said, and then there are numerous versions of these from Paris. Different books have different number. There's 5, I think, from book 1. We think some of these are revised by Scotus himself to reflect his later ideas. So this is why there's some discussion of examinata in the Scotus literature, that there's an official process that texts of consistent order were submitted to in order to let them circulate. So yes, we have 3 commentaries, and then the Ordinatio was kind of composed. The Lectura we think is very early, the Reportatio is late, and the Ordinatio is kind of in progress. We never really finished it. It's got lots of material stuck in it, either by Scotus or other people. Large sections of Reportatio stuck in there, maybe by Scotus, maybe not. Nobody's really sure. And there's also lots of notes. He's often revising his own opinions. There's lots of notes in his own hand that survive, or at least that are reported to be his own hand. Then kind of in his late career, he disputed a quadlibet, which is about 21 questions. The quadlibet is in a debate that anyone present in the debate can ask a question on any topic, and then the master responds to it. And Scotus he did one of these. Probably was around 1305 to 6, and then he was revising that for a year or 2 before he went to Cologne, and then he seems to have revised up to the last question of the quadlibet. So that the quadlibet is a fairly finished text, even though unfortunately there's no modern edition of it. It's so the Reportatio and the quadlibet both are there's no modern critical edition. With the quadlibet, this is because, well, the emphasis has been on the sentence commentaries, and also there's, I don't know, 40 or 50 manuscripts of the quadlibet, so it would take a very long time. And he also has some smaller treatises. He seems to have had his Proof of Existence of God excerpted by somebody and circulated on its own, called the Treatise on God as First Principle. And then there's something called the Terra Mata, which is a collection of yes, it's in the axiomatic style of having petitions that you then derive various conclusions from, and he's got various topics in this book, and it's not studied much because, well, it's very difficult, and no one is quite sure of the authenticity, because it seems to contradict what it says in other places. So people have tended to give it a wide berth. So there's quite a debate. I mean, Gilson based some stuff on this. There's quite a debate in the early 20th century over how to take it. The critical edition has been made in 2004, but no one has really worked on it since then. So yes, I think that's his main works, and he's known, of course, for a number of issues, theology and philosophy. Of course, in theology, the Immaculate Conception, whether or not, there were, of course, antecedents to this, but he probably made it a main issue of debate, which isn't to say that he, just settled it or anything. He kind of started a more intense period of debate. He also had this idea that Adam hadn't sinned, Christ would have become incarnate anyways, which people call the primacy of Christ. So that's kind of a big theological topic. He also has many Trinitarian ideas. From distinction he applies in the Trinity, which is probably more controversial than anything else. The claim that you can have distinct definitions in God, perhaps you could put it that way. Of course, Univocity being, which is in the netherworld between philosophy and theology. And he's got a lot of discussion of the will. He's very famous for the will, voluntarism, and the idea that the act of the will is independent of the intellect, or at least that depending on how, if you think he changed his mind or not, how the intellect will relate. He thinks the will has a primacy, and maybe the will doesn't intellect at all, as it pertains to God. This has to do with divine foreknowledge and how God knows events on Earth, and also some kind of contingency, how creation happens and how contingency works in creation, and then the divine choices. Even with the divine ideas, he seems to have initiated a shift in the way the divine ideas were seen as less principles. You somehow have to explain how they're present in God, more simply divine thinking. I mean, once you posit univocity, it kind of enables you to posit a commonality between various human and divine attributes, and then and kind of explain divine thinking maybe on the model of human thinking, or at least have kind of a common model of thinking that you apply to both God and creatures and
Mm,
angels. So, right. So many topics of intuitive
right.
and intellectual cognition, and um, yes, natural philosophy. I can't think of so many points. And he tended to reject the principle that Aristotle's proof existence of God was based on, that everything that is moved by another,
Right.
because he thought this would conflict with free will and the way the will and the intellect and the soul were related.
So if I can then ask, even though the Duns Scotus is this great sort of towering figure of scholasticism, and eventually a lot of his ideas sort of take on a sort of defense and commentary tradition of their own. In our modern day, in the 20th century, there was a very bizarre sort of reading of Duns Scotus, and it's sometimes what's called the Scotus Story. Um, would it be okay if you can explain what the Scotus Story is, or why it's so popular and prevalent today?
Um, well, it's hard to do so without being snarky, but I'll do my best. I mean, basically, the idea is that SCOTUS ruined the world.
Mm,
Um,
right.
so um, now, what it seems to have gelled around is that the twin claim that, or the two doctrines of the will and univocity, that these are what cause modernity in various ways, or in some ways. So anyway, it's a cause and effect story, that you have these positions in Aquinas that are known a priori to be safe and true and approved. And Scotus deviated from these positions, and we had various bad effects in every area of society. Now, this is a purely modern phenomenon. I mean, it kind of comes from the neo-Thomistic revival of the 19th century. So it's, you don't find, when you read, say, medieval Thomists, they will generally argue against Scotus. Now, they're not often directly reading Scotus. Maybe they're reading other Scotus. Maybe they're reading, reports of Scotus. But generally, they try to make arguments, unlike the moderns.
Mm,
It's not to say even that all moderns just like Scotus don't read Scotus. I don't want to say that either. But yeah, the modern Scotus story, yeah, mainly focuses on the will and univocity being, and the claim is that because Scotus criticized Aquinas, that then Occam came along and radicalized everything, and then after Occam, you have Martin Luther. So we just have the snowballing effect of all these bad things we don't like. So of course, this is very, you know, well, it's also confessional in the sense that if you're Catholic and you don't like Luther, of course Luther is a bad thing. But of course, maybe if you actually like Luther and you're Protestant, you might, you know. So there's a certain element of, subjectivism here. But yeah, and so I mean, this is very common today, largely in history departments and theology departments. I would say mainly because, especially in theology, the people that work on this material use SCOTUS are primarily interested in doing other things. So they're trying to do systematic theology, and in that case, they're not trying to do reconstruction. So they don't
mm.
really care really what SCOTUS actually said. For their purposes, they just want a position that they can ascribe to somebody that they can, say is bad. And
Gotcha. So if I'm correct, then the Scotus story is sort of a genealogical account that claims that Scotus's ideas of univocity or voluntarism, they had a sort of ripple effect among later philosophers and theologians, and it represents like a turning point in medieval scholasticism, where Scotus is radically departing from the precedents, set before, or the presuppositions that are held, and this eventually leads to theological breakdowns, in the Protestant Reformation, and eventually leads to or these early modern thinkers like Descartes or company, right?
Right, and even current modern stuff, that people don't like. So
it's almost as though Scotus is sort of there as like a punching bag for
yeah,
people to knock down. Okay.
right. And
Well,
it's largely because with the Thomist revival, 90% of the people working in medieval philosophy are going to be working on Aquinas. Because historically, at least, the Thomist revival, and which I'm not knocking, because it started both, revival and systematic, the manual Thomism, but also it started Leo also wanted the people to do historical studies of Aquinas in the Middle Ages in order to reconstruct, in order to do the critical editions of Aquinas, which is where the traditional scholarship that I come from, and that all comes out of there, is that medieval studies, as we know it, as applied to philosophy and theology, comes also from the Leonine revival. So it's the two sides of the same. It's just that some of the systematicians kind of also I would say that the analogy being was much more important in the 19th and 20th century than it was in previous times. Which is not to say that it's always been under discussion, but it was never as major an issue as it is now. Like now, it's become kind of the fundamental principle of Christian thought, which I don't think was ever the case before.
Gotcha.
And so that to threaten analogy being is very worrisome, and it affects people that don't work in medieval at all, that are just doing literature studies or something. So it's really the Scotus thing has been picked up. It's been relatively popularized by the group called Radical Orthodoxy, which itself is mainly theologians, mainly Anglican, but there are other fellow travelers.
Sure.
And right.
Gotcha. If I could then ask, before we discuss maybe sort of how that the Scotus story sort of became so popular as a narrative, I figured we could maybe dive into Duns Scotus and give a sort of brief sort of overview of some of his big philosophical positions and theories. The big one that people often turn to as sort of a pivotal or shifting moment in medieval scholasticism is this doctrine of univocity. But what is the doctrine of univocity of being for Duns Scotus? What ultimately is Scotus's primary reason for arguing for this position? What's going on there?
At least in Scotus, one could say that it's the issue of what kind of knowledge of God that humans can have in the present life. So kind of presupposing original sin, even since he is a theologian. So he'll distinguish between in via, the present pilgrim state, and the kind of knowledge we have now, as opposed to, say, in patria, the kind of glorified state in which we have access to God. And then we'll also talk about maybe in the Garden of Eden what human cognition might have been like before the fall. But for Univocity, it's generally what we're talking about, what's going on now in the present pilgrim state. And it's always very actually difficult to, because of course, right, it's always in contrast with analogy, and we think of Aquinas, but Scotus himself, so he's trying to talk about how we have natural knowledge of God, and he had a model for this. Actually, he took as his model Henry of Ghent, who was a theologian who had died the generation before, who died. Henry died around 1293, but still a number of students in the Franciscan order, or at least people that had adopted a lot of Henry's ideas, such as Richard of Conington and Cowton, and actually William of Ware, I think, was somewhat Henrician as well. He's thought to be Scotus's own teacher. Right, and so it's very difficult for us moderns to get our heads around this. But even though now Aquinas is the guy for analogy being, just in the 13th century that wasn't really the case. And Scotus, yeah, so he's trying to do knowledge of God, and he goes after Henry, and Henry Henry's view is very very complicated, and I won't rehearse it, but it has to do with he has a lot of distinctions and concepts that Henry makes. With Aquinas, it's a little hard to tell sometimes if you're talking about terms or concepts or judgments, and you can the vast literature on Aquinas on analogy somewhat reflects this. I think that there are fundamental imprecisions or unclarities looking at Aquinas from the modern perspective, post Scotus and Occam, what you might want to ask from Aquinas. But that's why I think the literature on Aquinas is so vast for what's supposed to be a simple point. But with Henry, so Henry is extremely complicated, and Henry seems to have at least worked it down to that you had kind of a concept of God that was completely other than the concept of a creature. So your divine concept, and these special names for these, which I won't worry about. And they seem to these concepts are irreducible, and so the problem is how to go from your concept of your concept you have as a creature to the concept of God. And they're trying the Henry Scotus, they all think that we can do this and that we can do this without divine revelation. So there's got to be this natural, you got to have natural cognition of God somehow. And maybe that there's texts like St. Paul and in the Psalms, the heavens tell the glory of God and so on. So I think they were kind of conditioned to think that we just have this some knowledge about God, maybe it's not much. And of course, with philosophy, you can maybe prove the existence of God. Scotus has this very complicated proof. Aquinas has this 5 ways. Henry's got a proof. So you arrive at this term God at the end, and then you're like, well, how do we know this? What definition do we have? And then the answer for Henry is that through these kind of irreducible concepts, and that somehow the mind has to go from one, they're so close, the mind can make the jump somehow, even though they're very different. And Scotus rejects this view and thinks that there has to be some sameness between these two, the content of these concepts, in order to account for how we can know God. And which brings us to then what Univocity means, and this is another difficult point that is often overlooked, which is, so Aristotle defined Univocity as saying, well, you can look at with the Aristotle definition that things are said univocally when they're the term instead of many things. The term and the definition are the same. So two things have the same term and the same definition. So Socrates and Plato, or a horse and a cat, or something, all have animal in common, a nature in common. So might want to say that some kind of nature and a term corresponding are in common. But Scotus does not use this definition. In fact, he doesn't use this definition at all in his later writings, his true writings. So basic ordinatio, quodlibet, and reputatio. And this is, I don't think it's been very well appreciated, and I'm not, or even the reason why. And in his comment in the category, so Scotus actually changes his mind. Univocity, Scotus started out holding a view that sort of in reality outside the soul, there's maybe analogy is kind of like dependent relations and various kinds of cause-effect things. And then he thought, on the purely conceptual level, this might be equivocation. So this was kind of a common view at Oxford, even that the level of concepts, when we talk about God and creature, substance and accident, that it's purely equivocal. Whereas outside the soul, there's some kind of prior posterior relation. And in the categories, in the categories Scotus wrote before he'd made the jump to Univocity. And the categories, he says that he parses the definition from Aristotle and says that it's kind of unclear what Aristotle has in mind here, because you have these in the Latin, in the definition, it's implied that there are things. So we're saying things are said univocally, which is kind of strange because they don't really say things, predicate things, predicate maybe terms and make propositions. Also the example Scotus points out, the examples that Aristotle uses when he talks about these definitions are also all real things. And so then it looks like when you have, and the way this is interpreted then as well, so it means that you can have univocal words and things and concepts. You can also interpret this as meaning that when you have the kind of things and concepts kind of correspond kind of directly. And so the kind of the major hurdle for holding Univocity before Scotus was that, well, you can't have things that are diverse in reality and not have them be diverse in your mind. So for example, you couldn't have the concept of Socrates and Plato unless as two concepts, unless Socrates and Plato were two things out in the world. And so the main issue then with Univocity is that if you talk about God and creatures, well, if God and creatures agree in some concept, then concept must correspond to something in reality. It must just be some nature that it signifies. When you talk about Socrates and Plato are both humans, humanity is a kind of a substantial form that is being signified there that they both share. So it seems like if you say that God and creatures are something you have in common, then it's going to look like God and creatures share in something outside the soul, and then you're going to have all these problems that, well, but what is this thing outside the soul that God and creatures agree in? Genus. And Aristotle had argued against there being a genus for being. On the religious level, you might not want God to be to agree with the creature, to be in a genus of the creature, because you might be able to compare God to a creature, and that seems contrary to the divine uniqueness or the divine kind of absoluteness. Philosophically, you might think that, well, you prove the existence of God, and God is supposed to be prior than everything else. You can't have something prior to God, some kind of nature prior to God. It looks like there's all these reasons to say that Univocity just is simply impossible. At least on this Aristotelian definition of Univocity, that you've got a name with the corresponding, the same name and the same definition going with names. But then Scotus himself, well, and first we'll say that Scotus is not the first to hold Univocity. It's commonly believed that Univocity was the common opinion in the 12th century among the 12th century thinkers. The perfections are univocally common to God and creatures. And there's been what's his name? Alexander Neckham, I think, even says this explicitly, that positing transcendentals in common or come to God and creatures is just a common opinion. And then now, of course, you might say there's some wiggle room there because this is while other Aristotelian works are being translated. Perhaps once all this stuff gets integrated, once the metaphysics is in there and the posture analytics, that they're not going to say this anymore. But I mean, I've even found references. There was some guy. I don't know who it was, but there was some guy probably in the 1270s who held a more extreme view of than Scotus had. Scotus actually attacks this view in Ornatio, stronger view, and a number of other people also attack this other view. So Scotus is not the first to say this by any means, even in the 13th century. In any case, once we get to Scotus, in the Ornatio, he says that, well, in order to avoid controversy, I'm going to define Univocity in this way. It says there's these two. Now, hard to say what these are. All the Scotus people themselves agree on what this definition really is, or how to describe it. He says that for a univocal concept, you need that when you affirm and deny it with respect to the same, you have a contradiction, and that and that it can serve as a middle term in a syllogism, or at least such that you don't have a fallacy of equivocation. And so then you have these two, we'll just call them maybe features for now to be neutral, because are they conditions? I mean, what are these things? No one is really, there's a small debate on how to take this. Right. And so anyway, you have these two conditions for univocal concepts. It's not the Aristotelian definition. It's not quite clear how it relates to the Aristotelian definition. Aquinas, when he attacks Univocity on grounds of divine simplicity, is definitely using the Aristotelian definition. So there's a kind of disconnect when you compare Scotus to other thinkers. Then he just takes this definition, then he says that, well, so you have this, and we can write, so we have all these concepts, and it must be the case that, when you're certain about something, some concepts we're certain about, some concepts we're doubtful about, and it must be then that, per the principle of non-contradiction, you can't be certain about something and doubtful about something at the same time. So you can't have a concept you're both certain and doubtful about. And then he says, well, but when it comes to the case of God, we can be certain that God is a being, but doubtful whether or not God is infinite or finite or substance or accident or something like this. And then from this he concludes that, well, because of this, we can then conclude that the concept of God is other than the concept of the concept of being is other than the concept of God, other than the concept of creature, and therefore it's univocal. And that's kind of his most famous argument for Univocity being from the certain and doubtful concept. He thinks that the major is true, the idea about the certain and doubtful concept is true from the principle of non-contradiction, and that the minor premise that we can be certain that God is a being or blah blah blah. This is true simply de facto from the history of philosophy, that we have all the pre-Socratic, for example, arguing about the first principle. So they were all, certain that there was a first principle, but doubtful whether or not it was water or fire, air, and so on. And this argument, yeah. So Scotus definitely thinks this argument proves that being is both, a separate concept and that it's univocal. So that means that whereas Henry had said that you can have a concept of, just concept of God, and then the concept of being in the categories is another concept. Scotus thinks you can break this down and have, a concept of being other than the concept of God and other than the concept of a creature. And so this, and so there are a number of ways or areas or ways one could go from here, but basically he describes the concept of God then as a complex concept. So you've got the concept of being plus infinity for the divine being. And the concept of a creature is also a complex concept composed of being plus our finitude, various created perfections or limited perfections. Right. So this concept of being is, and then because the concept of being is included in both the complex concept of God and the complex concept of a creature, it's supposed to be univocal. Now, this was challenged quite a bit by various people who said that, well, Scotus was not actually justified in this conclusion. All you can really prove from this argument is that the concept of being is other than, the divine being, the created being, not that it's also univocal. So it's quite an extensive debate on this argument for this reason. I mean, some attacked the major premise, some the minor, and so on. But most of the discussion was the claim that the conclusion doesn't follow. So you can find this starting in Cajetan. And
so then, if I can ask, is it ever explicit that Duns Scotus is concerned about equivocation in our reasoning?
Well, I mean, his overall aim is to say that there is natural knowledge of God. I mean, it's built. I would say it's built into the conditions. So one of the conditions is just that it can serve as the the middle term of a syllogism, and the syllogism is the kind of engine of, in Scotus' time, was the engine of philosophy and theology. I mean, you make arguments via syllogisms, and that's just how theology was done. I mean, Aquinas, the Summa is full of 10,000 syllogisms. So it's and Aquinas himself, I mean, the Summa Cogentiles, Aquinas also has arguments showing that analogy does not fall into equivocation either. So Aquinas is also concerned to avoid this claim because he's the way. So, I mean, analogy itself has kind of main strands, or at least two texts in Aristotle it goes back to. One is the categories, where you just have the basic divisions of terms being between equivocals, univocals, and denominatives. And then there's the metaphysics where Aristotle says being is said in many ways. And the being is said in many ways, then, in reference to substance, this is what kind of in the Arabic tradition became very big and important. And this is what the word analogia was attached to. This is what Aquinas uses. Being is medio modo is the kind of the metaphysics text that's filtered through the Arabs. And then this was also common at Paris. And then at Oxford, where Scotus was, and more common among all the Franciscans, was actually the other texts in which equivocity and univocity are kind of the ultimate dividers of terms. And Boethius organized kind of everything under equivocity. So all the different modes of analogy would all be under equivocity for Boethius, and the what we call pros hen from the metaphysics would be a form of equivocity for Boethius. So for Scotus on these guys, they would consider that to be equivocity to begin with, and would not even really consider that to be the way. Now Boethius divides it into equivocations, chance by chance, and also like the word
design, yeah,
and design, yeah. And Aquinas, it's not fair that Aquinas did not know this. I mean, if you even look at the chapter titles of the Summa Contra Gentiles, you can tell that he has these divisions in mind. He builds these into the titles. I think Aquinas, very well what he's about, but this is another reason why it's difficult to compare both Scotus and Aquinas on analogy and on univocity, because they tend to focus on different strands of the tradition, or develop different strands of the tradition.
Right.
Well, so I think I tend to think that Aquinas and Scotus are actually talking past each other. They're not directly contradicting each other. But that's of course a position that that's the Macedo, and a position from the tradition also. So there's really nothing new to say.
Sure.
But yeah. So then I'll just kind of summarize more. So, but the argument for and also. So the arguments for univocity, you have the certain doubtful concept. Another one is the claim that when we do conduct any kind of metaphysical investigation of God, we have to kind of purify our concepts. And part of that argument also is the idea that we're starting now, kind of from the present life. All we have access to is our concepts, phantasms, and so on. And the problem is that means that if we don't have the univocal concept, we're not going to have any concept at all of God. That the analogical concept can't serve, because the analogical concept is kind of something you get once you already know. You got the prior and the posterior. There's a relation. You got to have that relation in mind before you can see that it's analogical. But even get God, Scotus thinks you need a univocal concept that equivocal won't do. But I don't know if he ever comes out and says, "I'm doing this because I'm worried about equivocity," but that's kind of the concern, because he would probably classify analogy as a form of equivocity itself.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then the kind of major strategy Scotus has then is so he's got these like 5 main arguments for univocity, or univocity being. He has a number of arguments. He's got a question on the object of the intellect, and in there he kind of distinguishes what univocity applies to, and there he says that the attributes of being, so the one, the true, and the good, are not part of the concept of being, but they're sort of included in things that are being, and also the ultimate differences of being. That there was some debate on what ultimate differences are. There's specific differences or individual differences, but in any case, he says they're pure actuality, and the concept of being functions like pure potentiality. It's only determined, and so the ultimate differences are outside of the concept of being, but they're included in things that are themselves beings. So like Socrates and Plato include an ultimate difference, and so it's they're related to being that way. And then there's other kind of objections, that kind of standard objections, univocity, and so Scotus doesn't really have like a systematic account that covers the whole. He's got this, proof for univocity, discussion of the scope, and then replies to objections. And then so the initial group are all about natural knowledge of God. Now there is a late annotation which he reorients all these arguments and tries to develop new arguments that are just based on the principle of metaphysics. So he says that the arguments for the natural knowledge of God, these are kind of proper arguments, but there's more general arguments for Univocity being developed, and like he thinks the notion of comparison and the notion of cause, and there's a couple of like really just bedrock metaphysical ideas that he thinks all have to be univocal and prove univocity.
And then if I can understand, if I can then ask, with respect to Scotus's arguments for univocity, or maybe even Scotus's philosophy as a whole, I remember you said that sometimes in medieval scholasticism, theologians, because of the limited circulation of works, theologians would sometimes not so much rely on the thinker's actual work, but summaries or maybe hearsay of what they've heard. I know that Thomas Aquinas, if I understand, in his sentence commentary, when he's addressing Anselm of Canterbury's arguments for God, there's some debate whether or not he's got, the actual proslogion in front of him, or if he's got like summaries on handy. But is that the case with Scotus, that some theologians later on or philosophers will not so much rely on Scotus's actual works, but more so summaries or what other people have said is such and such position?
Yes, it depends really what period of time you're talking about.
Sure.
Because at least with like Alan Walter has some articles, I think, on Occam about how in the 1920th centuries you would have mainly, I think, Occam's positions in the manual tradition, like they would just keep expanding on the Occam position that they ascribed to Occam, just adding more and more points to, but all of it was spurious. In the medieval times, I think it just depends on the thinker.
Sure.
Because so one source though is Peter Ariel, because Ariel wrote this massive commentary, and Ariel summarizes a lot of Scotus in there, and a lot of Franciscan stuff is summarized in there. And William of Ware, and he also summarizes his own critics and Scotus's critics, like Hervaeus and Thales is in there, and Gerard of Bologna. William of Ware probably said that, and it's a pretty handy source to get to see arguments going on by 1320. So Ariel's that text, his scriptum, is about 1318.
Sure.
And then that text, when you look at someone like Capriolus actually just uses that,
right,
as opposed to Scotus. So Capriolus has these, in one part he's got like 18 arguments he ascribes to Scotus and Univocity, but all of them they're all verbatim out of Ariel, and I've not been able to find the source of them at all, because Ariel doesn't actually even say that they're Scotus. They're just kind of the opening arguments, and I've not been able to source them. But how extensive this is in Capriolus, I don't know. Just that I read his stuff on Univocity, and he was actually he was definitely relying on Peter Ariel there.
Sure.
But it depends on like Franciscans. Like Occam. Some of these guys, Occam is quoting Scotus verbatim. I mean, when he's arguing with him, you can even sometimes, if you are so concerned, track down the manuscript tradition that Occam is using. And a number of the early Franciscans of the 1320s do this. Petrus Tomei and Moronis and some of these guys, that you can, it's so close to Scotus' own writings that you can, it's word for word, and you can detect variants that you have variants now from. So in the text. And Kazjan also, so in his Kazjan's commentary on the Summa, he also is quoting Scotus verbatim. He's not relying on Ariel; he's using Scotus himself. And now Kazjan had to be careful, of course, because there was Scotus in his day teaching at the same university that would fault him for using something like not using Scotus. So he was always in debates with Trombetta. So he had a reason to be careful. And whereas Jonathan Thomas I've read, and he does not seem to have direct knowledge of Scotus at all, or at least on the Univocity issue, he doesn't seem to really use Scotus directly.
Interesting.
He reports opinions among the Scotus, I think, that I also don't recognize, even though I've read most of the stuff from that era. Of course, it could just be stuff that's lost.
Sure.
It could be garbled somehow. Who knows?
Sure.
Yeah, but And then there really was kind of a shift though in the presentation of the idea into making it just about Univocity. I mean, initially it was about natural knowledge of God, and so a lot of the people, that's where it gets kind of treated. I don't think that the Univocity analogy really became a massive issue though in the Middle Ages. I did come across an Augustinian who wrote a treatise against Scotus. Um, yeah, it's on the and it's called "On the Analogy Being Against Scotus" or something like this by Augustinus or somebody or other. Um, but he's mainly concerned with Scotus's views on ultimate differences in the attributes of being, not on the Univocity proper.
Okay.
And then there's also the contemporary of Cajetan, the Dominican, who's also in Rome. Now I forget. He also has a question against the Scotists, and if I remember, he is not he quotes Aristotle verbatim, but not Scotus.
I see.
So yeah, I mean, really, it's really that there doesn't seem to be any like interpretive key to help you understand like who is reading what. It's just people in the same order are probably more likely to read Scotus directly, and um, people
Sure.
early into Scotus. But like Hervaeus, Hervaeus, they'll gives kind of similar arguments, but they're clearly not verbatim. He's just kind of summarized. Now, is that because he's not reading Scotus, or just because he doesn't want to write it all out? I mean,
Sure.
it's really hard to tell, especially that people could these could be oral these could be reportationes based on oral reports from classes that we have left. So it could be that they were reading out of a text of Scotus, they were just going from memory. I mean, there's all sorts of problems. But there
Sure.
does seem to have been a development into, I mean, so I think actually with our in kind of in response to Ariel, it became more of a debate about Univocity itself. You have a number of thinkers responding to Ariel who wrote kind of just separate treatises on Univocity. These are all Franciscan, Peter Tomei and Francis Moronis, who wrote straight treatises on being and on so and once you get to that period, then the Univocity become part of the basic problem, the problem of being, and not about natural knowledge of God at all.
Sure.
Or at least that's kind of downstream on the main issue. So it's almost as if the Scotus' own late reorientation to making it a basic problem of metaphysics was followed by some of the more systematic Scotus thinking
I see.
of the 1320s.
I see.
Later, so these guys were not often read after the printing press, or like Peter Tomei was not read at all, and so some of Moronis was read. Like Moronis's main works were published, but not the ones that are actually interesting, I think. And so a lot of this was kind of lost, and so you get back to the Scotus, 17th, 18th century masonry, these guys, and they're kind of just using the Wadding edition.
Sure.
The previous tradition, they're unaware of. They're just names.
I see. And then, if I can ask, with respect to the sort of Scotus story narrative, how do the sort of Scotus story adherents or popularizers, how do they read Scotus's approach to analogy and univocity? As I understand it, they kind of see, as you said, this kind of see as like a linchpin that sort of destroys all of philosophy.
Yeah. Basically, I think they think that univocity and analogy are incompatible, and so they assume that because Scotus rejects, or because Scotus affirms univocity, thereby rejects analogy. Which, if you're used to Aquinas, then you would, and you're used to the Aristotelian definition of univocity, you can see why you might think that. Because then you're going to think that, well, Scotus must obviously think that God and creatures agree in something real outside the mind. There must be some real nature out there that God and creatures agree in. So Scotus must be, destroying divine transcendence and so on. Yeah, and then the Scotus himself it's pretty unclear what his views on analogy are.
Right. Yeah, as I understand it, his ordinatio, he says that not only can God and creatures be spoken of analogously, but also univocally, and he never gets around to saying how analogy and univocity relate in that kind of later Scotist that's how you get the ball rolling in the Scotistic tradition, where they're trying to see, okay, how do we make these two ideas fit together. But as I understand it, with respect to the Scotus story, is that a lot of people will make the case that Scotus's idea of univocity sort of places, they make the claim that it puts being in some sort of genus with specific differences. It as you said, it destroys God's transcendence, to where he's the common terminology is, he's a being among other beings, is how it's typically phrased, and that this is completely antithetical to what came before with folks like Aquinas and Bonaventure, who hold that God and creatures, we predicate being of them analogously, and that this univocity does away with all that. Would you say that that's fair?
Well, yeah, I would say that is what they say.
Okay, yeah. Would it be correct? I've heard it often said that the univocity being, it's a vicious concept, or I think that's what Richard Cross says. It's an ens rationis. It's a concept that we formulate, but nothing outside is just being independent of infinite or finite or subject or accident, like things like that. It's a concept that we formulate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I would not myself call it being a reason.
Okay.
Because that can often be generated by the mind. So you can have, so that could be like, the concept of genus, as opposed to the concept of Socrates. So like first and second versus second intention, those you might call those second intentions, you might call beings of reason.
Sure.
So you just have to be clear that the concept of being we have is all kind of contained in, our phantasms in the world, and we abstract it out. So now Scotus does have a different view of how all the psychological process works, and Aquinas does as well. He does think we've got, agent and passible intellect and so on. So, and phantasms, and we think that you can abstract out, the concept of maybe, the concept of being and goodness and wisdom, blah, 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 these things, all these perfections. And that now, but they have to come from the real world, otherwise it's not going to be any kind of real concept. We will call the concept being a real concept because it's drawn from the world, the concept of things in the world. Now, what he thinks is that these concepts, as we initially pull them out of the phantasm, are the complex concepts, so that you have a concept of created being and finite being and human, and he thinks that we can break all these down into their component parts. And so it's the concept of being, it's still something we pull out of the phantasms, out of the world, but it's kind of contained in all these other concepts. And then once we're in all the concepts, we can break it and kind of just the pure concept of being. So that's what Richard Cross calls, if I understand him right, is calls the vicious concept, because when you have the pure concept of being, once you've made that, you perform that operation on it, that concept itself no longer corresponds to anything directly in the world. I mean, it originated in our concepts we pulled out of the world, but it's not a concept that itself signifies an actual nature out in the world as such.
Sure.
Like our concept of humanity, it might signify, human beings out in the world, but the concept of being does not signify that. So in that sense, it's just breaking down the pure, correspondence of a concept with the world.
Gotcha.
I don't know that Scotus's critics latch onto that. I mean, one could perhaps, but I mean, this is actually a kind of a something Thomists themselves are divided on, because some of them will actually accept that you can have a concept of being that's independent of God and creature. Some of them will not. They'll just revert to Henry's position and say that there's only one or the other. There's only these two concepts. But that is an instability within the Thomist tradition itself.
Sure. Yeah. As I understand it, a lot of the later Thomists, that especially in Bologna, they want to maintain that there is a one concept of being, and then there's debate on, okay, how does that one concept relate to the plurality of the analogates and et cetera, et cetera. I think that was the position of Capriolus and Flandrensis, and eventually someone like Soncius will come along and hold a position that's very, very close to Scotus, and this is all sort of in effort just sort of allow for valid syllogistic reasoning. But anyway, okay, I think that we've got a good handle. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say one more thing on the radical orthodoxy thing. Also, the case that this is the being among beings business as well. That the interpretation of Aquinas also goes through kind of cycles, and there are of course trends of heavy emphasis on the Aristotelian side of Aquinas versus the Platonist side. So for the Aristotelian, I mean, you could think of Gergu Lagrange, who basically is also writing syllogisms, like Aquinas practically.
Right.
And even people still, I mean, current people who are more interested in arguments will write this way as well. Whereas radical orthodoxy is coming out of the more Platonist interpretation. And for them, saying that God is a being is much kind of more heinous crime than it would be for somebody in the other extreme of Aristotelian Thomist versus a Platonizing Thomism. They're not gonna mind that as much. Now, I think Scotus just argues that there's for the proof of the existence of God, he just argues that there's kind of a first being in these different causal orders. I mean, I don't know if I've never been able to decide if I think that the being among beings charge is intelligible or not for medievals. It's hard to say. Now,
sure.
Meister Eckhart does actually deny that at least the ratio entis can be said of God. So, I mean, Scotus will accept all the being beyond being talk if there's still like some positive ground to all that somewhere.
Sure.
He'll accept Dionysian stuff if you're going to use eminence as well as remotion and negation.
Sure.
I don't think he directly addresses whether God is a being. Now Moronis does. Moronis actually has a question on this on whether or not God is a being, and I'm not sure who he's attacking other people. I'm not actually sure who it is, but he just argues it straight from Exodus. And he has the base of the Gilsonian metaphysics because, well, we know from Exodus.
Right.
Ego sum qui sum. So that would be my reply to, I think, the God beyond being, and so I mean the radical orthodoxy, now they themselves will say that they're doing kind of creative theology and they're not bound by the canons of traditional scholarship. They don't have to do exposition and quote texts and really prove anything. I mean that's what they're doing. I mean they're basically writing poetry, theological poetry. But at least if you want to, the claiming that God is a being among beings, because that's not really a medieval issue, I would say that that probably the most medievals would actually hold the Exodus on this point and say that Exodus kind of requires us to say that that God has being in some way.
Right, it's too modern of a way of describing things. Like depending upon what that statement means, it could be perfectly in sync with what the medievals are getting at. It could be completely right. Yeah. So if I can ask then, how does the Scotus story sort of take hold and become a sort of popular way of reading Duns Scotus's thought? I know you mentioned how, with Leo XIII, Aeterni Patris, there was a rise of Thomism and a growing appreciation for Thomas's thought. Was that when this sort of Scotus historiographical issue came about as misreading Scotus in this way, or how did this come about?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say exactly. Of course, at least so there was, starting basically in 1320, which is when Morona started fighting with Francis Morona started fighting with a Benedictine Thomist. There's been an endless debate between Thomas and Scotus on basically every point of philosophy and theology. So I think they were just already rivals.
Sure.
And the Scotus, in a way, there weren't really any Scotus, or very many, during the period of the early revival. Even Franciscans themselves were not teaching much Scotus at that point, as far as I understand it. I mean, there were still some. I mean, I still find some Scotus manuals here and there.
Sure.
But seems to be the case that Scotus weren't there really to fight it, and so Scotus was the Thomists were able to pull a fast one. But there had been so there's a very long article by Trent Pomplin in the Bulletin de Philosophie Médiévale 2015 or 16. And anyway, he goes into the long term historiography, and it goes back. Really, it seems to be that Univocity and analogy was not really an issue. That's kind of a much more recent 20th century thing.
Sure.
It was really, but the stuff with the will goes back much farther. And when the modern like German universities were founded, they saw themselves as restarting the tradition of Aquinas and reason, and saw Scotus and his emphasis on the will as kind of a caesura in the history of thought, as irrationality. And so already you have in the 18th, 19th centuries, both in and without Catholic circles, you have a kind of an animus against Scotus as, reason and will in opposition.
I see.
But the actual debates now, at least when you read like the 13th, 14th century guys, or well, okay, so the 14th, 15th century, really the places that they really attack Aquinas are not actually in Univocity or metaphysics at all. It's natural philosophy. For some reason, Franciscans really hated Aquinas' natural philosophy and just really go after him. I mean, so Scotus himself, because he's much harder to read than Aquinas, he just has this reputation of being a critic.
Mm-hmm.
And he does tend to use like Henry's views as a springboard for his own. And I mean, this was whether or not this was had become the style of that time, or if he started the style, it's kind of hard to tell. But and you get William of Wares too, who's right around the same time, just kind of surveying contemporary opinion. So Aquinas, Bonaventure, when they're writing, if they mention a contemporary at all, they'll refer to them as freedom and just kind of give like a one-line summary.
Sure.
But by Scotus's day, they're giving like very detailed explanations of other people's views. They're all contemporaries. I mean, Scotus will give 4 or 5 views: Charles of Rome, Godfrey, Henry, his own teacher, and analyze all these views. So it really had kind of shifted to a kind of much more of a contemporary debate you get with Aquinas. So this makes Scotus look like all he's doing is criticizing everybody without having much constructive thought. And then when it comes to natural philosophy, he really does criticize Aquinas a lot on natural philosophy. I mean, this is, I think, even modern, what do you call it? Modern scholars have, myself included, have tried to emphasize the extent to which Scotus and Aquinas are, or Scotus is a critic of Aquinas. But and it's true, in book 1 of the sentences, there's not very much. He doesn't have a lot to say about Aquinas. Book 2, though, there's somewhat more, quite a bit more, I think, in which Aquinas is almost at the same status as Henry. Is almost every single question attacking Aquinas on angelic cognition, on the the location of the crystalline heaven, all that kind of stuff. I mean, everything Aquinas is the enemy. So, I mean, Kadisheimer mentions this, that he was trying to write his commentary against all the attacks of Scotus on his contrary to Aquinas. So, they're already even going into the modern period. You had this view of Scotus as being very critical, something you need to defend against, not being constructive.
Gotcha.
And so once the kind of original period of the schools is over, and Catholics and Christians are rediscovering the scholastic tradition, they go to Aquinas, and then Scotus just looks like he's trying to tear it down. So I think it's kind of natural to they were very nervous about this and see him as kind of the enemy. And of course, Occam is also Franciscan, and he's well known to have had problems with the Pope and wrote lots of treatises against the Pope in his later years. So
sure,
Franciscans seem like a problem, whereas Aquinas seems all harmonious and calm, and the Scotus are just these nasty, raging critics.
Okay,
I feel like there's something I didn't answer in your last one, but I can't remember now. On the origin. Where was I going with that? The origin of I feel there's something that I've omitted.
No,
it seems to have been mainly the will. Oh, maybe the formal distinction. I mean, there's actually a lot of medieval debates about the formal distinction, and wasn't just Thomas versus Scotus. It was kind of Scotus versus everybody.
Right, and I remember reading a paper that by the time you get to Suarez, there's like 16 different variants of like what are real distinctions, what are, distinctions of the mind, what are mind independent beings, what are extrinsic, blah 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 blah. And I wonder if the charge of like scholastics making all these distinctions, I thought it was just a bad historiography, but like it does make sense. Like by the time you get to Suarez, like there are a lot of distinctions that are happening.
I mean, but you might need them. I mean,
right, exactly.
Philosophy and theology are easy. I mean, sometimes you need them. So,
right.
Yeah, so some of the people I work on were actually involved in all that kind of stuff. There's one quite famous version that developed seven kinds of distinctions. This was very popular in the Franciscan tradition, and also it was adopted by Lullists and went into Lull's thoughts, and also into some the late 14th century, and some Jewish writers adopted it to kind of. It was one of these works was translated into Hebrew and was then used to fight. The Scotists were used to fight Hebrew Veroists. So apparently there were Hebrew Scotists fighting with Jewish Scotists fighting with
that
Jewish
is awesome. I love that.
Yeah, so that was just a sevenfold theory, of course. And, but again, this wasn't it wasn't. Now that text was printed, but it was printed once, and it was it's in the middle with a bunch of Aquinas. I think the Franciscans were kind of unaware of it. So like Maestri, in the 17th century knows it, but there's kind of a revival to try to go after the Scotus was printed, in which the Scotus tried to kind of go back and be more sober. So I tend to focus more on the pre-printing press material simply because they're developing Scotus in a lot more ways, and they also had access to a lot more Scotus text than we have now. So like some of them had autographs, don't survive anymore, that they'll make comments about, and that's kind of interesting. But
gotcha.
Yeah, but then Francis had Francis had four modes of distinction, and anyway, there were a lot of these sorts of things.
Sure.
But after the printing press and whatnot, they kind of went back to three, just real distinction, formal distinction, distinction of reason.
Gotcha.
Among the Scotus, at least as far as I can tell.
Sure. And then if I can ask, with all this like revival of Thomism, and as you said, there was already kind of a tradition of pitting Scotus against Thomas Aquinas as sort of like, the kingpins in rival gangs, so to speak. One of the big figures that sort of comes out of this Thomistic revival in the 20th century is Etienne Gilson. Etienne Gilson he's a famous medievalist. He's a famous Thomist. He wrote a lot of works. Originally, he was a specialist on Descartes and early modern thought, but eventually he sort of shifted into focusing on medieval thought and specifically the thought of Aquinas. He wrote monographs on other thinkers like Augustine, or eventually he's going to make a monograph on Scotus, but primarily it's Thomas Aquinas that he's focused on. But what can you tell us about Gilson's reading of Duns Scotus? Does it at all play into this sort of Scotus story? I ask this question because whenever I kind of have a complicated relationship with Gilson. He's not exactly my favorite Thomist. He's very kind of famous for making these sort of narrative accounts of like the history of philosophy, and the difference between a plethora of thinkers and then of course Aquinas. Does he at all play into this sort of Scotus story of blaming Scotus for the problems of modernity or whatever?
John Milbank has said so. Milbank is kind of the father of the radical orthodoxy movement. I think he says this. There's an online symposium about a book about the Scotus story, the Horan book, and I think there Milbank says that Gilson is basically inspiration for their. Now I don't know if Gilson really does the real decline and fall. And
if I remember correctly from reading Gilson, he does tend to give genealogical accounts of philosophy, and he sort of likes to give contrasts of like early on it was like Thomism versus Augustinianism. Like in the Unity of Philosophical Experience, the problem of the history of philosophy was the conflating the diverse speculative sciences. I'm trying to remember if he ever attacked Scotus for Univocity or
I don't recall so. I mean, the he goes after him a little bit in the on the other one. What is it? The not the universal experience, the being in some philosophers.
Right, right,
He, and again Moronus, he sort of conflates Moronus and Scotus. But Scotus has actually very little to say about essence and existence. No one can quite actually decide what
right,
Scotus on that is. I think there's very little there, but I mean, he does at one point, I think in that book where he mentions Scotus' view on essence and says that it's a Platonism that's like the kind that's anterior to that of before Thomas Aquinas. So basically, the idea is that once Aquinas came along, it was definitive and everything was established, and then why
right,
you revert to this archaic view of essence. Um,
right. Essentialism, I think, is what he
right. Yeah.
charges.
So but I don't think, I don't know that Univocity he ever worked that into. In his book on Scotus, he does talk about it,
Oh,
but I mean, if I remember there, he was quite fair. I mean, he doesn't agree with it. He says his book on Scotus, he's going to side with he does side with Aquinas, but
right,
there he's like doing this stuff. Well, I'm a Thomist, I can't do anything other, and it's
right,
um, I mean, there again, what's his name? Pomplin has a good discussion because he digs into that. He digs into some of Michelsen's letters, where like Gilson, I think, was trying to do justice to Scotus. So I think he
right.
was trying to wrestle with the text and was trying to
Sure.
explain it, and not be ideological about it. Um,
Yeah. So I think that with respect to Gilson, uh, by the time he writes his monograph on Duns Scotus, I don't think he's trying to give the sort of Scotus story that eventually folks like Milbank and others will give. I
right.
think he tries his best to be fair to Scotus, but it's kind of difficult to do that because I don't think at the time that Gilson was doing his studies on Scotus, the critical editions of Scotus were available. Like there was still confusion and conflating of texts and
Right. Right. So this is something I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. That something like so there was an opera omnia published by Wadding in the 17th century, that by the Irishman Luke Wadding, that contains something like 40% spurious material. So
okay,
quite a significant portion of just not by Scotus, by other people. I mean,
right.
people before him, people after him. I mean, it's just
It's just yeah,
a lot of junk in there. So it's quite a bit of so like the it's why you really can't trust anything written before the critical edition, or at least you have to be you shouldn't read it unless you're a specialist, because you have to do a lot of checking to make sure that they're like the one book from around the turn of the century was by Harris. There's a 2 volume set of books on Scotus, but they used the De Rerum Principio, which we now know to have been written in the 1280s by a different Franciscan with completely different ideas about matter and about I forget what it was, but anyway, you have to be very careful in the wide edition. So yeah, so Gilson, I think his book was finished in 1950, the same year as the first volumes of critical edition came out. So I think he mentioned this in his preface that in a way he didn't realize that Aquinas wasn't Scotus's primary interlocutor, that it was Henry,
sure.
which is what really I think was one of the discoveries of the critical edition, that it's not about Aquinas.
Right, right,
Like he's not most time he's not even on Scotus's radar, at least for book one
sure.
of the sentences.
Alrighty, then I can ask.
Which is, I would just say though that sorry that doesn't mean that Gilson's book actually has no value. I mean, it's not based on the critical text, but I mean, Gilson at least, I mean, would have known what the genuine texts were by that point,
Sure,
because I think Gilson had been publishing, or I'm sorry, Balich had been publishing, and but still, I mean, I would say it would still be useful, because even though Aquinas and Scotus doesn't deal with Aquinas all the time, it still gives you it still is a text in which somebody tries to compare the two together. So I still think that Gilson's book is worth thinking about. It's just that you have to be careful.
sure. Alrighty, then if I can then follow up, we've sort of discussed how there's a tendency to pit Scotus and Aquinas against each other, sort of in the late medieval and Renaissance era. Then with the Thomistic revival in the 19th 20th century. There's kind of a tendency to see Aquinas as like the pinnacle of all things philosophic, and everything everything up to that point, everything afterwards is sort of either a prelude or a decline. And then eventually we get to in the late 20th century, we have this movement called the radical orthodoxy movement. What is the radical orthodoxy? What's going on in there? What are their aims philosophically? I know you've alluded to it a little bit before.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're primarily theologians. So it's in a way, I think they started in the 90s.
So relatively recent.
It is, and they come out of Thomism, but I mean, they're not. I wouldn't say that they're doing really writing Thomistic theology. I mean, they're doing kind of more the modern kind of, they talk about Hegel and Plato and Rilke, and I mean, they're just doing something completely different than than what I'm doing, which is basically studied medieval debates and
right.
With
respect to the radical orthodoxy movement, as I understand it, they're sort of the ones who have sort of popularized this idea of Scotus as like the bogeyman of scholasticism, and in particular, it's John Milbank is this one figure in this sort of group of theologians who sort of makes these claims about Duns Scotus. Would you say that's correct?
Milbank himself has not written much about Scotus. He does have his famous book is, I think, Theology and Social Theory. He only has like a couple of paragraphs in there about Scotus. And then he did, right around the time Horan was finishing his book on the modern, on this Scotus story, Milbank published a volume work on called Representation. I forget the title, but there he did actually have like 4 points which he thought Scotus had bad effects on things. But before that, that was relatively recent. That was like 2013, whereas I think Pickstock had actually said a lot more. Catherine Pickstock was another Cambridge theologian. She has a book called After Writing, where that came out, I think, in the early 2000s, 2003 maybe, and that has quite a bit more. I mean, not much on Scotus. It's on liturgy and all this other stuff. Scotus is just kind of this something that's talked about on the way.
Mm-hmm.
But she does go against Univocity there and says that that it makes God into makes genus and puts God in the same level of creatures.
Right.
Also, they like to say that what's the other one? Oh yeah, that it's contradictory because it is simultaneously. Because when Scotus says that the proper concept of God is infinite, this makes God like completely unreachable to us. But then we put him in a genus with us, and so God is both unreachable and knowable, yet just like us. And so this is like a contradiction.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, if I remember correctly in my studies of the radical Orthodox movement, they're not exactly trying to do sort of historical critical work. They're kind of using a lot of these thinkers as a springboard, not to dig into them, but they're kind of using a lot of these thinkers as a springboard to sort of showcase their own ideas and the like. And even that they're reading of Aquinas, it's not so much Thomas Aquinas himself that they're interested in or want to be historically critical with. They're more interested in folks like de Lubac or the ressourcement movement rather than Aquinas proper.
Right. Yeah. They're not really doing expository scholarship on Aquinas or creative. They're not doing like creative stuff like even like Pritvara, just kind of developing Thomas. They're kind of just, they're expanding their own views. I think they're like developing all the stuff they read.
So
they're doing something very different. And
would it be correct to say that this sort of reading of Scotus as this problematic figure, is it kind of I wouldn't say it's the dominant view, but it's certainly an influential view, as you said, among theology departments and philosophy departments today, that they read Scotus in this sort of Scotus story light?
Yeah, I would say it's universal now.
Oh, okay.
It's not just, it's also in history departments and literature departments. just about everywhere.
Gotcha.
But I don't know that, yeah, and at this point, even I think it's so far downstream that even the radical Orthodox themselves don't even cite it often anymore. I think
I see.
it's just so universal. And I mean, people have always been kind of sloppy when it comes to Scotus. I mean, you can even find this in Thomas writers that they just won't bother to cite Scotus, or they won't cite him as well as they cite Aquinas. And yeah, so all this, I mean, radical actually was kind of bad for this too, that they'll cite Scotus in translation or in a French translation or something odd, and they themselves seem to have been rather. I mean, they're at least when it comes to Scotus, they're reacting to Gilles Deleuze, who claimed that all of the history of thought goes back to the Univocity being, and that's like the ultimate claim of philosophy. And he Deleuze takes Scotus and Spinoza as like the prime examples of this. So they're really responding to that, which again, Deleuze's stuff is so far off from Scotus also.
Right.
I mean, he's also just doing like creative, I don't know what it is, literary theory or philosophy or something,
Sure.
but
It's not Scotus.
he doesn't even try to claim that it's accurate. They're responding to this completely inaccurate position with their own stuff, and their reply is analogy of being is what gets you around these problems, and
Sure.
Scotus rejected that, and then they make historical claims. So they should engage in some historical scholarship there to justify this, but they don't, and or at least
Gotcha.
they jump from Scotus to Occam, and I mean I'm not sure what the idea seems to be that once like a new idea comes on the scene, that everyone thereby endorses it. I mean, I don't know that maybe nobody, maybe the problem is that nobody has an idea of how ideas actually work in history. Maybe that's the real problem. But
Oh, I see.
the idea from them seems to be that once Univocity comes on, everybody adopts it instantly. But there were lots of critics, and there were lots of views on it of Univocity, and you had Scotus going along maintaining analogy, but that didn't matter. The fact that all of these SCOTUS retain analogy for hundreds of years, that matters not at all.
Right.
Because Univocity has already sufficiently ruined the world.
Right.
So I don't understand. I don't know what this is. It's just it's like SCOTUS and then Occam, and then after Occam, everybody's an Occamist, and after Luther, I mean, it's just. But all these groups continue. Thomism
Right.
continues. Luther or Ockhamism continues.
Sure.
I mean, Thomism and Scotism were both considered part of the Via Antiqua.
Right.
The Via
And if
Moderna is Terminism, not Scotism.
and if I remember correctly, from reading Jennifer Ashworth's papers, it's not the case that this debate on analogy, like there's a precedent and tradition for arguing for these positions well before Aquinas and Scotus come onto the scene. I mean, there are Islamic theologians that are concerned with these problems. There are as you said, Boethius has this sort of fourfold division of analogy and equivocation, and think that it's really the case that Aquinas and Scotus are coming out of a broader tradition worried about logic, semantics, analogy, and that sort of thing.
Right, and yeah, I mean, a lot of it. It's hard to see that it's not much more than arguing about how to classify terms.
Sure.
So it doesn't seem to me to have the like mystic import that it now has and
Purports,
has
right.
much of the 20th century. Because when you read the text, that's most of what they're arguing about is that analogy has an analogous terms function this particular way and not this other way, and it's very stipulative, and they're arguing about definitions, and
Sure.
I just don't see how you go from there to the rise of capitalism and exploitation of workers and so on. Like I just don't
Right.
see the connection. I mean, people says, well, it made piety devolve. But how did it make piety devolve? I mean,
Mm.
lay people, very few lay people were even reading this stuff.
Right. Exactly.
Nobody, once I got this, I found this book in the library of book lists from Spain of like what parish priests had and different collections of books that have been passed down, and lots of priests had the Summa or one or two works of Aquinas and the Fathers, and once in a while they would have Scotus, but pretty rare. And
Right.
did they care about Univocity? Probably not.
Right, exactly. Right. It's more of a modern concern about
It's
or I
very,
shouldn't say modern. It's a later
yeah. I mean,
concern and
it was not to say there
emphasis.
wasn't debate. I mean, Thomas rejected, of course, but
Sure.
there's actually a massive debate within the Franciscans. The Franciscans themselves have extensive debates over how to interpret every part of Scotus's doctrine.
Mm.
So I mean,
And it's not helped by the fact that Scotus oftentimes changes his views or develops his views later on in his works, and that's the same with uh, Aquinas. That from what I found is that if you read his sentence commentary, he tends to change or amplify a lot of his views than what he gives us in his sentence commentary for Aquinas.
yeah, and the Scotus side is true on a number of points, especially the formal distinction. It's very different in Oxford and Paris. I think Univocity, though, is fairly stable.
Okay.
So once he gets Univocity, so initially he completely rejects it, and it's quite interesting because all the arguments that he originally has when he argues against it, he thinks are conclusive. Gradually, they all get transformed to objections against the position he now holds, and he refutes them all. Um,
Interesting.
so it's a very interesting internal conversion there. But and Univocity thing is fairly stable. Like in Paris, there's one question, he just affirms it, but it's very, I mean, it's interesting. He doesn't have the two conditions for univocal concepts.
Oh, interesting.
You kind of need that, but he doesn't have that at Paris. He doesn't mention that at Paris. Um,
I
that's not in
see.
his earlier work either. The Lectura there, it's only it's a marginal addition that the editors claim is spurious, so they don't print it in the main text.
Right.
And I mean, one of the conditions shows up in the Ganima questions as an argument. So I think, yeah, yeah. So a lot of parts of Scotus are kind of in flux, but the Univocity, apart from the two conditions, I think is fairly stable. I mean, the ultimate differences. I mean, most of it's pure not like it doesn't come up much at Paris. It doesn't talk about much at Paris. I don't know why that is the case, but whereas I mean the formal distinction, he's got massive discussions. I think because the formal distinction seems to conflict with divine simplicity, which is much more of a core belief, whereas natural knowledge of God, I mean, everybody kind of agrees.
Hmm.
I think they just Voss was either was just not seen as a threat, or it was people were just not that interested in it.
Sure.
Whereas the he seems to have held actual debates where he had to clarify his position on divine simplicity of Paris, so it was much more the formal distinction was much more threatening. I mean, there are debates. I mean, Petrus Tomei, all these guys have these large texts on this, and the now the oh, that's where I was going to go. So I mean, there is one person, Antonius Andrea, a Iberian, he's Catalan, I think, and in his he wrote a commentary on the metaphysics that kind of combined, so he plagiarized part of Aquinas's literal commentary on the metaphysics and kind of changed it a little bit to make it friendly to Scotism. Then he copied in Scotus's questions of metaphysics. But for the Univocity question, you can do this because Scotus's Univocity question of metaphysics, as he has shown, is kind of a mishmash of multiple versions superimposed on each other. And so for that question, Antonius composed his own question. And there he actually goes and makes Univocity something that obtains outside the soul. So he's the only Scotus I know that does this. But
Right.
if you're going to go with this claim that Scotus did all these bad things, well, you can see that Antonius took Univocity and took the one step that he shouldn't have made. Because he
Right.
does say that God and creatures, insofar as they are not nothing, must agree in something outside the soul. And what could that be? It could be. So
I see.
he's the only one I know who said this. He's got like maybe a one-line comment about this, and
Right.
the text is not edited. Maybe it's not genuine. Who knows?
Sure. Sure.
Um, yeah, but yeah. So yeah, I mean the person who's seen so I mean yeah, so Radcliffe actually creates this view of Scotus, and the only person that seems to correspond to is actually not Scotus, but this other thinker by the name of Nicholas Benages, who lived in the 1530s, and
Mm-hmm.
um, he says a lot of similar things, but it's interesting that he was known and he's often referred to by Scotus as being kind of outside the Scotus tradition. So,
Oh, okay.
I mean, even as late as Maestri talks about it and says, well, he's got these positions, but we don't hold those positions. I mean, it's very clear that he's kind of seen as something of a pariah among the Franciscans.
I see.
He's got a very interesting text, though. I mean, he claims that being is univocal, inside the being, outside the being, or inside the mind, outside the mind, God, creature, substance, actions, everywhere it's univocal. So it's closer to a view that radical orthodoxy claims Scotus has.
Interesting. So
And it's close to something, as you also might say, and that Benetus is quite clear that he says that being is a quiddity, and that you just kind of combine it with these various, things like God or creatures. You have these various other concepts you attach it to, and so I mean, it's similar to what radical orthodoxy says about Scotus, but they don't do this kind of work, so they don't know about this stuff. But
right, and really no all of subsequent Western philosophy would probably not know about him either.
No.
The idea that
it's quite fascinating because he was actually the first person after Aristotle to compose a fresh treatise on metaphysics. He wrote a metaphysics designed as a metaphysics, not as a commentary in any sense whatsoever. I mean, it's the first metaphysics since Aristotle. I mean, if you want to say that, so you could say that Avicenna is maybe the first since Aristotle. We could also say that Avicenna is kind of copying the general order of the Aristotelian, the Aristotelian sequence of books. Whereas Benetus is not. He's got this new metaphysics. He starts figuring out what metaphysics is about, and then just goes through all these consequences. And then, everything is basically attaching different quantitative notes to quiddities, and that's how you get different sciences, by attaching different intrinsic modes and things to your quiddity being. How you get theology, it's how you get natural philosophy, and so on. It's the whole course. And then it was quite funny because there was a Spanish author in the 50s who wrote an article called, it was like, I mean, in Spanish, but it was like Nicholas Benetus, the first metaphysics after Aristotle, before Suarez. There's like before Suarez in the title. But all the Suarezians had never bothered to read this. So the Suarezians keep claiming there's all these things with Suarez, makes him the first person after Aristotle to do blah blah blah. But it's all in Benetus.
Interesting.
It's quite funny. And I mean, there was even a recent companion to Suarez or something that came out in like 2015. They had all these claims about how Suarez was the first modern thinker because of the things he did, and then I just kind of lined up all their claims with stuff in Benetus, and it was all there.
Interesting.
So if you're looking for the beginning of the modern age, it's not Scotus, it might be Benetus. I mean, maybe radical orthodoxy is right. It's just that Benetus ruined the world and not Scotus.
Sure.
In which case, the next gen radical orthodox people should be reading Benetus.
I think that we've covered pretty much everything that I thought we should cover in this episode. I guess maybe as concluding thoughts, what are we sort of to make of the Scotus story, or I guess it's not necessarily the Scotus story, but really sort of any genealogical account of philosophy or like leading to narratives. It kind of seems more so rhetorical and less argumentative to just sort of bring forth these leading to, or these genealogical meta-narrative accounts. They're not helpful for conducting philosophy, and they're not helpful for conducting history, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would just want people to read texts of Scotus, but Scotus is hard, and so it's not surprising that people need summaries. And
Sure,
I don't know. I mean, Scotus. The main thing is actually that some people don't seem to grasp that. I guess that philosophy is not about memorizing positions or about accepting what other people say. I mean, everyone kind of comes along and kind of adds their own thing to it. So there's no reason really, no external reason for Scotus to simply accept Aquinas. And this is what you get from the radical orthodox people, is that it's always a sense that Scotus just didn't heed Aquinas' warnings or take his advice. I mean, it's like he's a wayward child or something. And but I mean, Aquinas makes arguments, and if the arguments don't work,
they don't work, right?
Yeah, then you need, for the next Thomist who tries to fix them up.
Right.
I mean, that's just. I mean, if anything, yeah, I would say that the scholastic thought is much closer to what we have now. Probably analytic philosophy is what's closest, and that you have these theologians all kind of trained in a similar method who then debate with each other and have positions. And maybe philosophy religion would be better because people are more or less religious, and so they've got kind of a set of maybe creedal statements they all agree with, and then they debate all how to interpret them.
Sure.
Because that's the main thing. To read the text, understand that these are arguments. And Scotus, I mean, he's only good as his arguments, and there's lots of you don't need to resort to the genealogical method. There's plenty of Thomists who made arguments, and
Right.
one can read them and see if their arguments work or not.
Sure.
Now that's much more, it's not something. Maybe that's more of a personal thing. If you had to teach a class on medieval philosophy covering 500 years, maybe you just want to do a rise and fall. Maybe that's practically, maybe that's where this sort of stuff comes from. But
Mm.
I don't know. I think it's just better just to teach Franciscans. They have their kind of, after a while, they have their distinct kind of authorities and they like to focus on, and their distinct metaphysical principles, and they kind of develop those. And the Dominicans have their authorities and
Sure.
principles, and they develop those, and they clash. And I don't know that the clash has ever been resolved because they never resolved the difference in principles.
Then, do you have any resources? I know you said just read Scotus directly is helpful, but as you said, he's not the subtle doctor for nothing. Are there any resources that you'd recommend for anyone who'd want to continue studying Duns Scotus, and in particular with this discussion? I thought that Daniel Horan's one book, Postmodernity, Univocity, where he's attacking folks like Milbank and Pickstock, I thought that was pretty accessible.
Oh yeah, so it is. It is. Yeah, that's, I guess, right. The problem is that every topic in Scotus is has its own. I mean, Scotus research is criticized because it's so technical and has its own development. That if you don't have access to like all the journals, it's kind of hard to keep up on it. But yeah, I mean, for Univocity, the Horan book is accessible, and it's. I mean, I just don't think the radical orthodoxy. So it is everywhere. I mean, even art history people even make these claims. So, but it's just in a way they're not based on the text, and
Sure.
they're just not. I mean, it's not worth. I don't bother to read any of this stuff because it's just so far off. So
Sure.
it doesn't help us understand Scotus. If you want to understand Scotus, then don't read radical orthodoxy. I mean, I'm not saying don't read them, just read them for other reasons. um but yeah, so the Horan book, I mean, it would orient. He does more than just criticize radical orthodoxy, and he tries to give like a basic view of Scotus's position on Univocity, which I think, I mean, I've read it and I thought it was fine. It's accurate and
Sure.
text based and stuff. And other than that, yeah, if there's issues, I mean, there's often every issue's got its own body of literature. I mean, the Walter often Alan Walter's writings. He did a lot of translations, and they get criticized, but he also has commentary on a lot of stuff, and those are helpful. I mean,
Sure.
like, so he's got I mean, it's out of print now, but he has a translation, the De Primum Principio, the Existence of God treatise with extensive commentary. It's out of print. I think Tom Ward is doing a translation and commentary. And there's an old book by Ephraim Batoni that covers Scotus's basic positions, which I think is decent. I mean, he gets into some stuff that I think is wrong about whether or not Scotus thought we had innate knowledge of God or not. Well, that's a very kind of dear point maybe to worry about. But by and large, I think that's a decent survey. But there aren't a lot of like books that are kind of general surveys that aren't, extremely technical and detailed, and that's what Scotus is. So yeah, so I mean, I would just say read Scotus and maybe read the De Principio, or also the book 9 of the Scotus Questions of Metaphysics. Walter also translated that and gave a commentary. I mean, it's more of a paraphrase, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I found it helpful back when I was Scotus for the first time. And
Gotcha.
yeah, so it's kind of slim picking. So, like,
Sure.
I mean, Ingham has an introduction, which I haven't read all of it. I've read some of it and it seemed okay, but I think that's called like Scotus for Dunces. And then there's also the Philosophical Visions. I mean, so there's a bunch, but I mean, they all seem to me to be more or less kind of summarizing the same.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know that one really stands out. It depends on the level of interest.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining with us.
Anytime, yeah. Thanks for having me.